In a Chicago probate courtroom, my own mother stood up and told the judge I was mentally unstable and had no right to manage my 87-year-old grandmother's finances. My brother sat behind her, nodding, while her lawyer held up therapy records from 2008 like proof that I was a disgrace to the family. The room believed her. What none of them knew was that for the past 18 months, I had been quietly tracking every dollar moving through my grandmother's account. And I'm not just a worried granddaughter, I'm a certified fraud examiner. By the time the judge leaned forward and asked if the lawyer knew who he was accusing, I already had bank footage, forged signatures, and a notarized document that should never have existed. My mother thought she could bury the truth inside a family argument. She had no idea she had just walked it straight into a courtroom. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Believed She Chose Right. February 2025 was colder than usual in Chicago. The wind coming off Lake Michigan cut through the streets and wrapped itself around the stone walls of the Cook County Probate Court building. I remember thinking that the air inside the courtroom felt even colder. I sat at the defense table on the right side of the room, hands folded over a thin legal notebook. The wooden benches behind me were mostly empty, but the quiet felt heavy, like the room was waiting for something unpleasant to unfold. Across the room stood my mother. Diane Kessler was 66 years old, dressed in a dark navy coat that she had probably chosen carefully that morning. She stood beside her attorney, Calvin Mercer, who was already speaking to the judge. This was not a misunderstanding between strangers. This was my mother asking a court to take away my authority to manage my grandmother's finances. Mercer spoke in a calm voice that carried easily through the quiet room. He explained that my grandmother, Eleanor Whitlock, was 87 and increasingly vulnerable. He said that my mother was requesting emergency guardianship over her financial affairs. Then he began explaining why. He said that I had pressured my grandmother into trusting me with financial matters. He said that my behavior had become increasingly unstable over the years. Then he slid a folder across the table toward the judge. Inside were records from therapy sessions I attended when I was a college student in 2008. According to him, those records proved that I had a history of emotional instability. I watched him speak while writing short notes in my notebook. I had learned a long time ago that people reveal more when they think you are not reacting. Behind my mother sat my older brother, Nathan Kessler. He was 41, and he kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The night before the hearing, he had sent me a message. He said that I needed to stop harassing Mom and let the family move on. He had not asked me what had actually happened. He had already decided who was telling the truth. I did not look at him now. Instead, I focused on the quiet rhythm of Mercer's voice. He spoke about my personality. He spoke about my supposed inability to manage money responsibly. He spoke as if I were not sitting 3 feet away from him. The judge listened without interrupting. Victor Halberg had been a probate judge in Cook County for years. He had the kind of calm presence that made people lower their voices without realizing it. When Mercer finished his argument, the judge opened the folder that had been handed to him. He turned several pages. Then he paused. The pause lasted longer than expected. His eyes lifted from the paperwork and settled on me. For a moment, he studied my face as if trying to remember something. Then he looked back at Mercer. "Are you certain you understand who you are filing this petition against?" The question hung in the air. Mercer blinked once, clearly confused. "Your Honor, this is a family dispute regarding financial guardianship." The judge did not respond right away. He closed the folder slowly and rested his hands on the bench. "Proceed," he said quietly. Mercer continued talking, but the rhythm of the room had changed. Even Nathan looked up briefly. I lowered my eyes to the notebook in front of me. The words on the page blurred slightly as a memory began pushing its way forward. Because none of this had started in a courtroom, It had started almost 2 years ago with a phone call. March 2023. I was in my apartment in Lincoln Park that afternoon. The sunlight was cutting across the floor in thin stripes through the blinds while I sat at my kitchen table reviewing documents for a case I was working on. My phone rang. When I saw the name on the screen, I answered immediately. My grandmother rarely called during the day. Her voice sounded softer than usual. "Marin, do you have a moment?" "Of course," I said. "What is going on?" There was a short pause. "I think something strange is happening with my bank account." I leaned back in my chair. "What do you mean, strange?" She hesitated as if she were embarrassed. "I think my money is disappearing." The words came out almost in a whisper. I asked her to explain. She told me that when she checked her balance that morning, it seemed lower than she expected. Not drastically lower, but enough to make her uneasy. I asked if she had made any withdrawals recently. She said she could not remember. I asked if she had purchased anything large. She said no. The concern in her voice was not panic, it was confusion. And that confusion was what caught my attention. People sometimes forget small expenses as they get older, but the way she described the situation felt different. I asked her a simple question. "When was the last time you went to the bank?" She thought for a moment. "Maybe a month ago?" "Diane usually helps me with that now." Diane. That detail did not surprise me. Since my grandfather passed away years earlier, my mother had gradually taken over small tasks for my grandmother, driving her to appointments, helping with paperwork. I had always assumed it was simply family responsibility. Still, something about the tone of my grandmother's voice made me uneasy. She lowered her voice again. "I did not want to ask your mother about it yet. I might just be confused." Then she said something that stayed with me. "You're the only one in the family who really understands this financial stuff." That part was true. For the past decade, I had worked as a certified fraud examiner. Most of my work involved investigating financial irregularities for banks and law firms across Chicago. I spent my days analyzing transaction histories and reconstructing patterns hidden in numbers. I told her I would take a look if she felt comfortable sharing her bank statements. There was another pause. Then she agreed. 3 days later, a large envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside were copies of her account statements from the past year. I remember spreading the pages across my kitchen table that evening. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but experience had taught me something important. Irregularities rarely announce themselves. They hide inside patterns. So I opened my laptop and began entering each withdrawal into a spreadsheet. Date, amount, location, time. One by one, the numbers filled the screen. At first, they meant nothing. Then the patterns started to form. Withdrawals ranging between $2,500 and $4,000. Not huge amounts, but they appeared again and again, every few weeks, almost always on a Wednesday or Thursday afternoon. I leaned closer to the screen. Those were days my grandmother rarely left the house. She liked to read in the afternoons. Sometimes she watched old TV shows. I picked up the phone and called her again. "Grandma, do you remember withdrawing $3,000 on May 12th last year?" She paused. "No." "What about $4,000 in July?" "No." Her voice was quiet again. "Is something wrong?" I did not answer that question immediately. Instead, I asked another one. "Who usually helps you at the bank?" "Your mother does." "Of course she does." I thanked her and told her I would review everything more carefully. After we hung up, I continued studying the spreadsheet. Patterns like that did not appear by accident, but at that moment, I still believed this was a misunderstanding, a small accounting issue, something that could be cleared up with a conversation. I had no idea that those numbers on my screen would eventually bring my entire family into a courtroom.
Chapter 2. The plan was written before I knew. I was buying time. That was the easiest way to describe what I was doing in the days after my grandmother mailed those bank statements. I told myself that if I looked long enough, If I gave the numbers enough room to explain themselves, the pattern would turn into something harmless. Most financial irregularities have ordinary explanations: a forgotten bill payment, a transfer between accounts, a purchase someone simply does not remember making. But the spreadsheet on my laptop refused to behave like that. I sat at my kitchen table late one night at the end of March 2023, with the blinds half open and the cold glow of the streetlights cutting across the room. My laptop screen reflected faintly in the window as I entered each withdrawal into a new column: date, amount, location, time, one after another. At first, the numbers sat there quietly, nothing more than rows in a table. Then I sorted them by date. That was when the pattern started to show itself. Withdrawals ranging between $2,500 and $4,000. Not large enough to trigger automatic alerts at most banks, but not small enough to be meaningless either. Every 3 to 4 weeks, another withdrawal appeared. Nearly all of them happened on Wednesday or Thursday afternoons. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitlock, had always been predictable about her routines. She liked quiet afternoons, books, old television programs. The idea that she had suddenly developed a habit of visiting the bank every few weeks without remembering it felt wrong. I called her the next morning. Her voice sounded calm, almost relieved to hear from me. "Did you find anything strange?" I hesitated before answering. I wanted to ask careful questions first. "Grandma, do you remember going to the bank on a Wednesday last May?" There was a short pause. "No, I do not think so." "What about early July?" Another pause. "No." Her confusion sounded genuine. I asked her who usually helped her when she needed to handle financial paperwork. "Your mother usually drives me if I need to go," she said. "She helps with the forms, too." The answer did not surprise me. For the past few years, my mother, Diane, had slowly taken over the role of helping Eleanor with errands and paperwork. It had always seemed like normal family responsibility. Still, something about the timing of those withdrawals kept bothering me. I asked my grandmother one more question. "Do you remember signing any documents recently that allowed Mom to manage your finances?" She thought for a moment. "I may have signed something last year. Diane said it would make things easier if I ever needed help at the bank." After we hung up, I returned to the stack of statements on my table. Buried among the pages was a photocopy of a document titled Power of Attorney. That kind of document was common for elderly clients. It allowed a trusted person to act on someone else's behalf in financial matters. There was nothing unusual about it, until I reached the bottom of the page. The document had been notarized. The name printed under the stamp caught my attention immediately: Thomas Ellery. For a moment, I simply stared at the page. The name felt familiar. Then I remembered why. Years earlier, I had worked on a fraud investigation involving forged property transfers. During that case, I had reviewed several legitimate notarized documents in the River North area. Thomas Ellery had been one of the notaries who appeared frequently on those files. He had a reputation for being meticulous, but something else about him stood out in my memory. He had retired. I pushed my chair back from the table and opened a browser window on my laptop. The Illinois Secretary of State maintained a public registry of notaries. It took less than a minute to find his record. Thomas Ellery. Commission expired December 2021. I looked back at the power of attorney document. The notarization date was September 2023, almost 2 years after his retirement. I felt a small tightening in my chest. There were only a few possible explanations. Either the document had been notarized improperly, or the signature was not legitimate. Neither option was reassuring. Over the next few days, I kept reviewing the statements. At the same time, something else began to change: my access to my grandmother. I drove to her house in early April one afternoon, bringing groceries the way I sometimes did. My mother answered the door. She looked surprised to see me. "Your grandmother is resting right now," she said quickly. I could hear the television in the living room. Grandma usually watched afternoon news programs around that time. I told my mother I would only stay a few minutes. She shook her head. "She has been tired lately. You should come back another day." Before I could answer, I heard my grandmother's voice faintly from inside the house. "Marin?" The sound came from the living room. My mother stepped into the doorway slightly, blocking the entrance. "She needs rest," she said quietly. The door closed a moment later. I stood on the porch for a long time after that. The wind moved through the bare branches in the yard. Something about that moment felt wrong in a way I could not yet explain. A few days later, I decided to call someone who might help me answer a different question. Her name was Lydia Ramos. Lydia worked in the fraud security division at the bank where my grandmother held her accounts. We had met years earlier during a financial investigation involving fraudulent transfers. She picked up on the second ring. "Marin, it has been a while." I told her briefly that I was reviewing some transactions for a family member and had a question about how bank records were stored. "Can branches pull surveillance footage from past transactions?" There was a short pause on the line. "That depends on the situation," she said carefully. "Those cameras record continuously, but access is restricted." I explained that I was not asking her to provide anything directly. I only wanted to know whether footage existed. If this turned into a legal matter, could someone confirm who conducted a transaction at a teller window? "Yes," she said after a moment. "If there is a subpoena or court order, the bank can release footage tied to specific transactions." That was all I needed to hear. After we ended the call, I returned to the documents again. This time, I studied the withdrawal slips that had been copied along with the statements. Each one included a handwritten signature. At first glance, they resembled my grandmother's handwriting, but familiarity can hide small inconsistencies. I placed one of the slips next to an older document that Eleanor had signed years earlier. The shapes of the letters were similar, but the pressure patterns were different. Certain curves were tighter, certain strokes ended too abruptly. They looked like someone had practiced the signature. Not perfectly, just enough to make it pass at a glance. I sat there for several minutes without moving. The feeling that had been slowly forming in the back of my mind finally settled into place. I had seen this pattern before. Small withdrawals, regular intervals, documents that appeared legitimate but contained subtle irregularities. It was the early shape of something I recognized from dozens of fraud investigations. Someone was taking money, carefully, quietly, in amounts small enough to avoid attention, and whoever was doing it had access to my grandmother's accounts. I closed the folder of documents and leaned back in my chair. Outside my window, the traffic on Clark Street moved slowly through the evening. For the first time since my grandmother called me, the possibility that this was not a misunderstanding began to feel real. The numbers on my screen were no longer just numbers. They were evidence, and the deeper I looked at them, the more they began pointing toward a truth I was not ready to say out loud. Chapter 3: The Hidden Scheme Behind the DNA. I spent the next few months doing what investigators always do when something feels wrong. I kept looking. Spring turned into summer in Chicago, and the city shifted into that humid rhythm that comes with July heat and lake winds that carry the smell of asphalt and water through the streets. On the surface, my life continued normally. I still worked my cases. I still met clients in conference rooms downtown and reviewed financial records late into the evening. But every night, I returned to the same spreadsheet: the withdrawals from my grandmother Eleanor's account. The pattern had not stopped. In fact, it had continued through the first half of 2024. The amounts stayed careful and consistent. $3,000 here, $3,200 there. Never large enough to look dramatic, always spaced just far enough apart to avoid attention. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. And the more I reviewed the data, the more one detail kept repeating in my mind. Every transaction had been processed inside the same bank branch, the one my mother used regularly. I tried more than once to speak to her about it. Each attempt ended the same way, short conversations that went nowhere. One evening in early June, I called her. I kept my voice calm. "Mom, I have been reviewing Grandma's bank statements. Some of the withdrawals look unusual." There was a pause on the line. Then her voice sharpened. "Why are you going through her financial records?" She asked the question as if I had committed some kind of offense. "Grandma asked me to help her understand them," I said. Another pause. Then she laughed quietly. "You always think something is wrong, Marin. That is what you do." I did not answer right away. The silence between us stretched longer than it should have. Finally, she said something that made the conversation colder. "You need to stop interfering in things that are not your responsibility." The call ended shortly after that. From that point forward, my access to my grandmother became even more limited. Sometimes my calls went unanswered. Sometimes my mother answered instead and said Eleanor was resting. I could hear the television in the background every time. Weeks passed like that. Then August arrived, and with it came the envelope. It was waiting in my mailbox on a Monday afternoon when I returned home from work. The return address belonged to Cook County Circuit Court. I knew what it was before I even opened it. Inside was a formal petition, filed by Diane Kessler, my mother. The document accused me of manipulating Eleanor Whitlock in order to gain control of her finances. It claimed that my behavior had become erratic and emotionally unstable. Attached to the filing were copies of therapy records from when I was a college student in 2008, records I had not thought about in years. I sat at the kitchen table reading the pages slowly. The strategy was obvious. If the court believed that I was unstable, every accusation I made about financial misconduct would look like paranoia. The numbers I had been studying for months would become meaningless. I called my attorney that evening. His name was Daniel Hargrove, a probate attorney who had handled complex estate disputes in Chicago for years. After reading the petition, he exhaled quietly. "This is aggressive," he said. "That is one way to describe it." He continued flipping through the pages. "They are trying to discredit you before any financial evidence appears." I told him about the withdrawal pattern. I told him about the power of attorney. And I told him about the notary name that did not make sense. There was a pause on the line. Then Daniel said something simple. "If your theory is correct, we need evidence that cannot be argued away." That meant two things: verification and documentation. Over the next few weeks, we began preparing for the hearing. Daniel filed a motion requesting transaction records and supporting materials from the bank branch where the withdrawals had occurred. Because the case was now active, the court approved the request. The subpoena allowed the bank to release specific transaction footage connected to the withdrawal dates. A few weeks later, Daniel called me into his office. The video files had arrived. We watched them on a computer screen in a quiet conference room overlooking LaSalle Street. The footage showed the inside of the bank lobby on several different days. Customers walking to tellers, people filling out deposit slips, ordinary moments. Then one of the clips reached the moment connected to a transaction. Daniel paused the video. The person standing at the counter was clearly visible. It was my mother. She slid paperwork across the counter and waited while the teller counted bills. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair. "That is not Eleanor." "No," I said quietly. It was not. We watched several more clips, different dates, different days, the same person, Diane Kessler, my mother. walking up to the teller window, signing withdrawal slips, leaving with envelopes. The pattern was no longer theoretical. It was visible. But one piece of the puzzle still needed confirmation: the power of attorney. In October of 2024, I drove north to Eventon. Thomas Ellery lived in a small brick house on a quiet street lined with maple trees that had just begun to turn orange with the start of autumn. He opened the door himself. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. I explained who I was and why I had come. He invited me inside. We sat at a small dining table near the window. I placed a copy of The Power of Attorney before him. For a moment, he studied the page without speaking. Then he looked closer at the stamp near the bottom. He adjusted his glasses. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "That is not my seal." I felt my shoulders tighten slightly. "Are you certain?" He tapped the paper lightly. "Very certain." He pointed to the printed name. My commission expired in 2021. I retired that year. He leaned back in his chair and studied the signature again. "That is not my handwriting either." The room felt very quiet. I asked him one more question. "Would you be willing to put that statement in writing?" He nodded. "Of course." He reached for a pen and began drafting a short affidavit confirming that the notarization on the document was not his. When he finished, he slid the page across the table toward me. I read the statement carefully. It was clear and direct. The notarization had not been performed by him. When I thanked him and stood to leave, he walked me to the door. At the threshold, he paused. Sometimes people think documents make something real, but paper can lie. Outside his house, the air smelled like fallen leaves. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. The pieces were finally aligning. Bank footage, withdrawal records, a notarization that could not have happened. Individually, each detail raised questions. Together, they told a story. And it was a story no one in my family was prepared to hear. By the time winter arrived, the court scheduled the hearing. February 2025, Cook County Probate Court. The same room where my mother would stand beside her lawyer and tell the judge that I could not be trusted. What she did not know was that by then, the evidence had already begun speaking for itself, and soon it would speak in a courtroom.
Chapter 4. The courtroom where the truth was revealed. The courtroom felt smaller than I remembered. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Cook County Probate Court, stretching across the polished wooden floor and the rows of empty benches. A few people sat quietly in the back, waiting for other hearings. Their presence made the room feel less like a courtroom and more like a stage where private family matters were about to become public. I sat beside my attorney, Daniel Hargrove, at the table on the right side of the room. Across from us stood Calvin Mercer. Next to him was my mother, Diane Kessler. She kept her posture straight, hands folded neatly in front of her. From a distance, she looked calm, almost dignified. Anyone who did not know the details of the case would have assumed she was simply a worried daughter trying to protect her elderly mother. Nathan sat behind her again. This time, he looked tired. When our eyes met briefly, he looked away. Judge Victor Hallberg entered the room a few minutes later and took his seat behind the bench. The room rose, then settled again. The judge reviewed the documents in front of him for several moments before nodding toward Mercer. "You may proceed." Mercer stood and walked to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor, this case concerns the protection of an elderly woman whose financial well-being may be at risk." His voice carried easily through the room. He explained that Eleanor Whitlock was 87 years old and increasingly dependent on others for help with financial decisions. He said that my mother had stepped in to assist her, but that I had begun interfering and creating unnecessary suspicion. Then he turned slightly toward me. The petitioner believes that Miss Maren Kessler has used her professional background to intimidate and manipulate her grandmother. He picked up a thin folder from the table. We have also submitted records indicating that Miss Kessler has a history of emotional instability. Mercer handed the folder to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Inside were the same therapy records from my college years. I watched the judge read quietly. Mercer continued speaking. Someone with this background may misinterpret ordinary financial activity as fraud. I heard a faint movement behind me. Someone shifted on one of the benches. The judge eventually closed the folder. He looked at Mercer. Anything further? Mercer shook his head. Not at this time, Your Honor. The judge turned his attention to Daniel. Mr. Hargrove? Daniel rose calmly. Your Honor, we would like to present a sequence of evidence related to the financial transactions at issue. The judge nodded. Proceed. Daniel looked toward me. I stood and carried a folder to the small lectern near the front of the courtroom. My hands were steady. Years of presenting financial findings in conference rooms and courtrooms had taught me how to separate emotion from explanation. Still, this time the audience included my own family. I began with the simplest document, a printed spreadsheet. This chart summarizes withdrawals from Eleanor Whitlock's primary account between January 2022 and July 2024. The clerk distributed copies. I watched the judge study the page. Each withdrawal falls between $2,500 and $4,000. They occur roughly every 3 to 4 weeks. Mercer stood. Objection. The judge raised his hand slightly. On what grounds? Speculation. Daniel spoke calmly. The records originate directly from the bank under subpoena. The judge nodded once. Overruled. I continued. Next, I presented copies of withdrawal slips from those transactions. The judge studied the signatures for several seconds. These signatures resemble Eleanor Whitlock's handwriting, I said, but comparison with earlier verified documents show clear inconsistencies. Mercer shifted in his seat. He stood again. Your Honor, handwriting analysis has not been formally introduced here. Daniel spoke again before I could respond. We are not presenting expert handwriting testimony. We are establishing a pattern of irregularity connected to the transaction history. The judge leaned back slightly. Continue. I placed another document on the lectern. These images were obtained from bank surveillance footage associated with several of the withdrawals. Daniel handed the judge a set of still frames taken from the video recordings. For a moment, the courtroom became very quiet. The photographs showed a bank counter and the person standing in front of the teller, my mother. Judge Hallberg studied the images carefully. Mercer leaned forward. Your Honor, these images do not establish wrongdoing. I spoke again. The transactions were conducted using a power of attorney document granting Diane Kessler authority over Eleanor Whitlock's finances. I lifted another document from the folder. This is the notarized power of attorney. The judge examined the stamp at the bottom of the page, and I continued. The notarization lists Thomas Ellery as the notary. Mercer crossed his arms. There is nothing unusual about that. I placed the final document on the lectern. This is an affidavit signed by Thomas Ellery in October 2024. The clerk passed it forward. The judge read the statement slowly. When he finished, he looked up. Mr. Ellery states that this is not his seal. Yes, Your Honor. He also states that he retired in 2021 and did not notarize this document. Mercer stood again, this time more quickly. Objection. The judge looked at him. On what grounds? The affidavit alone does not establish fraud. Daniel responded quietly.
It establishes that the notarization cannot be authentic. The judge studied the document again. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, he placed the affidavit back on the bench. "Mr. Mercer?" Mercer straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge folded his hands. "Your petition asks this court to conclude that Miss Maren Kessler is misinterpreting ordinary financial activity." Mercer nodded cautiously. "Yes." The judge glanced down at the documents again. "What I see here suggests a different possibility." Mercer did not respond immediately. The judge continued. "Withdrawals conducted by the petitioner, a notarized document that may not be legitimate." The room felt very still. The judge looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Hargrove, has this evidence been provided to the appropriate investigative authorities?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet, Your Honor. We were waiting for the court's direction." The judge leaned back slightly. He looked toward my mother, then toward Mercer. "This court does not determine criminal liability, but the materials presented here raise concerns that extend beyond a family dispute." Mercer lowered his gaze. Judge Hallberg reached for a pen. "The record will reflect that the petition for emergency guardianship is denied pending further review." He paused briefly. "The financial documentation presented today will be forwarded to the appropriate investigative agencies for evaluation." The sound of the pen against the paper seemed louder than it should have been. Mercer said nothing. My mother remained perfectly still. For the first time since the hearing began, Nathan looked directly at me. There was confusion in his expression, perhaps even doubt. Judge Hallberg closed the file in front of him. "This matter is adjourned." The gavel struck once. The courtroom began to stir as people gathered their documents. Daniel leaned toward me. "You handled that well," he said quietly. I nodded, but I did not answer right away. Across the room, my mother was speaking softly to Mercer. Their conversation was tense. Nathan stood beside them, looking uncertain. For a long moment, none of them approached me. The evidence had finally spoken, but the consequences of that moment were only beginning to unfold.
Chapter 5: The Consequences. I walked out of the Cook County Courthouse into a gray February afternoon that smelled like exhaust and melting snow. The wind cut across the street, and for the first time since the hearing began that morning, I allowed myself to breathe normally. Daniel Hargrove walked beside me down the courthouse steps. "The judge did what we needed," he said quietly. "The evidence is on record now, and it is in the hands of investigators." Across the street, I saw my mother, Diane Kessler, speaking with Calvin Mercer near the curb. Nathan stood a few feet away from them, staring down at the pavement as if he were trying to read answers from the cracks in the concrete. No one approached me. No one apologized. No one explained anything. I drove home alone. That evening, Daniel sent a short email. "The court has forwarded the documentation. Expect contact from investigators soon." I read that line several times. As a fraud examiner, I knew what it meant when a civil dispute crossed into financial crime territory. Once the process began, it rarely moved quickly, but it did not disappear either. 3 days later, I went to see my grandmother. Eleanor Whitlock still lived in the same brick house she had owned for decades on the north side of Chicago. The place smelled like tea and old paperbacks, the same way it had when I was a child. When she opened the door, she looked tired but clear-eyed. "You look exhausted," she said. I smiled faintly. "It has been a long week." She stepped aside and let me in. We sat in the living room, where afternoon sunlight fell across the carpet. A stack of crossword puzzles rested on the coffee table beside her glasses. After a moment, she asked the question that had clearly been waiting. "Is Diane angry?" I did not answer immediately. Eventually, I said something simple. "The truth is finally out in the open." She nodded slowly.
Marin, did I sign something I should not have signed? I leaned forward and took her hand. You trusted someone you believed was helping you. That is not the same as doing something wrong. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. For the first time since this started, she looked less uncertain about herself. The investigation began quietly. A week later, Daniel told me that financial crimes investigators from Cook County had opened a review. Because some of the transactions involved electronic transfers between accounts, federal investigators were also involved in evaluating the financial trail. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden arrests, just interviews and documentation. In early March, I met with an investigator named Brooke Talbot in a plain office downtown. She asked careful questions. When did I first notice the withdrawal pattern? When had Eleanor given permission to review her statements? Had I confronted my mother directly? I answered everything honestly. At the end, she closed her notebook. The pattern you documented is consistent with elder financial exploitation, she said. The notarization issue is also significant. I thanked her and left. Walking back through downtown Chicago, I realized something strange. For months, I had imagined the moment when the truth finally became official. I expected relief. Instead, I felt a quiet heaviness, because the person at the center of the investigation was still my mother. A few weeks later, Daniel forwarded a notice. Calvin Mercer had withdrawn from Diane's attorney. The letter used polite legal language, but the meaning was clear. Mercer did not want to remain connected to the situation now that the evidence had been examined more closely. When I read the notice, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not because I wanted him ruined, but because he had stood in that courtroom and tried to turn my past into a weapon. Now he was stepping away. In April, my phone rang one evening. Nathan. I watched the name on the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello? His voice sounded strained. Marin, it's me. I waited. I saw the records, he said finally. The bank footage, the transfers. Mom said you were exaggerating, but the numbers are there. He paused. I should have listened. I sat quietly at the kitchen table. Understanding something after the damage is done does not erase the damage, but it matters. I kept my voice steady. What do you want from me, Nathan? Another pause. I do not know, he said. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I told him that if he wanted to see our grandmother, that decision belonged to her. When the call ended, I felt the strange emptiness that comes when a long argument finally stops. My mother never called. She never explained what she had done. Instead, she withdrew into silence. But by then, silence no longer had power. The evidence existed outside the family, and evidence does not depend on anyone's approval. In May, I visited Eleanor again. Spring had arrived in Chicago and the windows in her house were open. A soft breeze moved through the living room curtains. We sat together with tea. She looked stronger than she had earlier in the year. Do you feel angry? She asked me. I thought about the question carefully. Not angry the way I expected to be, I said. I think I'm just finished carrying the confusion. She nodded slowly. Then she smiled a little. Your grandfather used to say something about money, she said. I raised an eyebrow. What was that? She leaned forward slightly. People can lie about many things, but money always remembers where it has been. I laughed softly. That sounds like him. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Inside was a simple financial plan for her future, clear account permissions, an outside attorney she could trust if she ever needed help, safeguards that did not depend on family loyalty. She looked through the pages slowly. Then she looked up at me. Thank you. That moment felt different from every conversation we had during the investigation. This time, there was no fear behind the gratitude, only relief. The investigation continued through the summer, and I knew better than to expect instant resolution. Financial cases take time. Records must be verified. Transactions must be traced. But the most important part had already happened. The The truth had surfaced. My grandmother no longer believed she was imagining things. Nathan no longer believed the easy explanation, and my mother could no longer pretend nothing had happened. For a long time, I believed revenge meant making someone suffer the way they made you suffer. Now I understand something else. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply letting the truth exist where everyone can see it. If you have ever watched a family story unravel because someone finally followed the evidence, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you the most and where you're listening from. And if you enjoy stories where quiet patience reveals the truth, stay here with us. There are many more stories like this waiting.